And now we continue the conversation on the domestic commodities markets with a research analyst at the financial derivatives company, Temitope Oluwile, who's here with us in the studio. Good morning, Temitope. Thanks for coming on the program.
Good morning, BC.
Well, let's begin our conversation with the latest development in the crude oil markets. Of course, this morning we've seen Brent drop again. It's trading about $40 per barrel. So what's responsible for the price movement?
So when we thought that, the extension of the OPEC cuts will prop up prices, Brent price to maybe $45 per barrel, we're seeing that rather today it's just approximately $40 per barrel. And that's because of the huge record buildup in U.S. inventories. We see that even this week, the American Petroleum Institute and the EIA have agreed, their individual reports agreed together that there was an increase in U.S. inventories. From the EIA was about 8 million barrels, increase, and even the API reported an increase in U.S. inventory. So that has, limited the gains that we should be seeing from, an extension of the OPEC production cuts, and even Libya having to reclose its oil production plan. So we see that has limited the gains, and we're back down to $40 per barrel.
Now, what about the demand for natural gas? Now, there are projections that it's set for the biggest fall on record. What's responsible for these projections?
Yeah, so, since the pandemic started, the hotspot commodity has been Brent, but shifting the spotlight a bit to natural gas, we see that there are projections of a 4% drop in consumption, and that's because the lockdown restrictions limited significantly reduced the commercial demand for gas for power generation and for heating purposes. And even on the residential household side, we see that the winter conditions were pretty mild this year, so that limited demand for heating purposes for households. So that is responsible for the the projection of a significant decline in consumption this year. And we see that natural gas is our second, it's one of our huge export commodities, accounting for about 14% of our export, revenue after oil. So we see that would have a significant impact, and that's just, worsening our external imbalances. You take oil, what's happening with oil, the shocking oil price, we take the, significant decline in natural gas demand, and you see that all of that would significantly affect our revenues and, widen our fiscal deficits.
And talking about our external reserves now, it has actually slipped further to $36.51 billion. What's fueling the decline we've seen lately? Not even the recent rally in oil price had been enough to lift it.
I mean, the rally in oil prices, as we see so far this week, has not really been sustained. I mean, yes, it's better than where we're coming from in April, but there's still that shock to our fiscal revenue, right? So we see that is affecting our external reserves. And even after we had the IMF loan drawdown, that after a while you start to have to, like now, you take from your external reserves into the forex market, because there's that supply deficit of forex in the market. So the CBN is having to intervene. We also have other important expenditures we're having to incur, as this health spending and all of that, and having to support the SMEs and just to ease the shock of the COVID pandemic situation on businesses and SMEs. So that is having a significant impact on our external reserves.
And talking about the forex markets now, of course, we've seen the naira steady at the parallel markets at 455 naira to the dollar.
Yeah, so we see that yesterday it was steady at, we're still about 455 to 457 naira per dollar, right? So that is, I mean, depends on what you call good news. But the stability that we're seeing for now, we will take it, right? But it's still a long way off from where we entered the year at 360 naira per dollar, and we still don't know what will happen, even as there's an increased demand for forex as the airports open, businesses start to open gradually, manufacturing activity starts to pick up. We expect that pent-up demand, even speculative, even the ones that are just demanding for speculative reasons alone, we expect that demand to begin to manifest soon. And if supply doesn't match up with the demand, we'll see that stability will not be sustained.
What's the latest regarding Nigeria's power output? I see some good news there, according to the slides.
Yeah, we see that, it's above 4,000 megawatts per hour. We're seeing that increase in power output, right? But in terms of consumers and, how we have to pay and the the expenditure on power that we're having to, we are seeing that, you know, the NERC is saying that, you know, very soon consumers will have to pay for increase for, will have to pay more for prepaid meters. We're seeing that news, and we're just wondering, you know, there was already the cry of, you know, prepaid meters, not the demand, you know, we're not seeing the supply matching the demand, right? There's that slow down, there's that period, there's that time lag between when you demand for it and when they supply it. So we're seeing that and that is not right now. Consumers are, if we're paying for something in the midst of a dwindling consumer disposable income, in the midst of rising inflation, we want to get the services, right? So they need to match up the services with the increased prices that they're demanding from consumers.
So let's talk about prices at the domestic commodities market. Now, of course, we've seen an increase. What's actually fueling the increase?
Most of it we think is artificial because, you know, it's the need to compensate for the increased logistic cost, right? You see that there's that rise in logistic costs, there's all these checkpoints, there's everything fueling, there's that interstate restriction, that these things fueling, you know, the logistics is becoming really difficult to take from the source to the markets, right? So that has to, you see that producers have to compensate for that increased logistic cost by passing the burden to the consumer. So we're seeing that there's that increase in commodity prices due to these reasons, and for some commodities also because their planting season has commenced, and so there's that supply shortages playing into the prices of these commodities.
So how long are we likely to see the prices spike? What's your projection for the prices in the coming days?
I mean, as we start to ease the lockdown, as we, you know, we have maybe 2 more weeks of this of this 30 days period that we are in now. So as we start to ease it, as we start to see, you know, airports reopen, as long as there are no restrictions to supply, right, we would see that prices should start to taper down. But if there are still restrictions to supply, there's still logistic costs, there's still logistics, you know, bottlenecks, we'll continue to see that increase. But I think that as we gradually start to get back to our new normal, as we reopen, as lockdown restrictions are completely gone, we would see that prices will start to taper down. And
so what's your outlook for agri-commodities?
Going forward, I think that agri-commodities it might start to taper down a bit because, you know, lockdown restrictions have eased, but I think that it will still remain stubbornly high, and especially as consumer disposable income dwindles, right, the reduced demand would start to play into prices, and we think that these prices will still remain stubbornly high, and that will feed into inflation, which should be released on Monday, and we're projecting that they will see a significant increase in inflation. But going forward, if supply restrictions are gone with, we should start to see a taper down.
Well, let's backtrack a bit to the prices of oil, of course, talking about the crude oil markets. Now, what direction are we likely to see prices in the coming days? What are your projections?
So I think prices will still be at current levels, which is what, $40, around $40, $42 per barrel. We don't see any significant changes in the market. We can only hope that demand picks up to a level that, you know, as more countries reopen their economies, we start to see that significant pickup in demand. Without that, the extension of OPEC cuts will really have limited impact on oil prices, but we only hope that demand pickup would start to manifest in oil prices soon. We
can only hope. Temitope Olugbile, research analyst at the Financial Derivatives Company. Thanks for coming on the program.